Chapter 1. Sparks in the Wreckyard. The wind that combed the Lahar Basin at sundown always tasted of iron and old electricity, a tang that settled under the tongue and made even water feel like a memory. And Orion Hale, who owned the smallest repair shed at the end of the Wreckyard's least profitable lane, had long ago learned to drink tea that boiled so hard it scalded that metallic aftertaste into submission. On the evening the story truly began, he was crouched on a cracked ferrocrete pad beneath the sagging belly of a mothballed freighter, teasing a corroded power conduit out of a web of fused cables, while the desert sky pressed down the color of burned sugar, and the distant Shield Mountains flashed with heat lightning like the heartbeat of some sleeping colossus. And he told himself that if he could coax this ship to hum for 3 more hours, he might afford a new set of batteries for the shed's backup lights, because the old ones flickered like moths and died without ceremony, and he hated the way darkness made the Wreckyard sound like it was breathing. He was not a man anyone would have bet on to change the fate of 1,000 star systems. He was thin and tired and had the look of someone who'd traded youthful speed for careful hands. And his reputation when strangers bothered to speak of him at all was as a decent mechanic who charged fair and never lied, a rare and curious quality in a place that ran on desperation. But even decency could not keep the dead agents from attaching red-lit clamps to the shed's exterior paneling or the water, bored from throttling his ration to a sullen trickle. So when the storm rolled in quick and low and the Wreckyard lamp stuttered and the dust lifted in curtains that glittered with static, Orion swore softly and crab-walked free of the freighter's guts, shoved his tools into a battered case, and killed every breaker inside his shop to save the charge for morning. Only then, in the pocket of hush that followed, did he hear the knock, 3 measured taps on the personnel hatch that was never used because the main door stuck less, and because nothing good came through a door small enough to make you stoop. He paused with his hand on the breaker box, the storm's first cold breath licking the cut on his knuckle where the conduit had bit him, and the second knock came, not frantic, not polite, but like someone who had learned to be obeyed and was practicing the habit gently. And the strangest thing Orion felt was not fear, but an aching, unwelcome sense of company, the way a lonely hearth anticipates boots on the mat. He unbolted the hatch, expecting a scavenger or a courier with bad news, and instead found 2 figures draped in travelers' cloaks slicked with grit, their eyes luminous in the dusk like coals banked under ash. And though they seemed young, their stillness made the air around them behave, the way the air behaves near a well-tuned engine that purrs and does not leak. The taller of the 2 inclined her head with courtly precision and said, in a voice that carried the faint thunder of distant furnaces, that their transport had died 20 clicks west with a broken coolant vane and a fried inverter, and that the night stretched long and unfriendly. And could they, for a few hours only, trade coin for shelter in his well-kept shop? Orion almost laughed at well-kept, because the roof leaked when the basin's rain slanted wrong, and the insulation had been chewed by micro-rats that preferred warm wire to seed. But there was pride beneath his ribs, and it was a true thing that every bench was clean, and every tool was oiled and hung in its place like a promise. And something about their eyes' ancient patience wrapped around a furnace-blue core made his palms open to the memory of his mother's insistence that hospitality is the last law even when all the others are pawned. He stepped aside, told them he had only tea and a single heater coil, warned that the floor was a jealous thief of heat, and the shorter traveler laughed with a sound like flint on steel, and said warmth was no trouble to them. And as the storm shouldered the hatch closed, he noticed, as mechanics notice, a constellation of details that did not add. The fine powder along their boots was not only basin dust, but also ash of an industrial grade that did not exist within 200 clicks. The buckles of their cloaks were not stamped or grown, but hammered with the hand of a master. Their wrists bore the ghosted shimmer of field regulators that cost more than his shed, and when the taller one unfastened her hood, the air wavered around her like heat above a reactor throat. And he thought without meaning to, without daring to dragons, and then chided himself because dragons belonged in star ballads told to children to make them sleep with their mouths open. But the word had hatched and perched behind his eyes. And when he offered cups, the taller took hers carefully as if picking up a sparrow, while the smaller wrapped her hands around the kettle as if greeting an old friend, and the steam twisted in patterns that made his breaker lights hum in sympathy. And it was then, as rain snared itself into a net over the wreck yard, and the storm's breath clogged the gutters with cold, that the taller traveler said they would pay not in coin, but in true favor, and Orion, who had not been offered a true favor since his father vanished into the forest of the belt, and returned as a debt carved on a ledger, felt the gravity of the night tilt. They told him names, but Orion understood even as he heard them that names given on the road are like masks worn to a masquerade. Useful to speak and be spoken to, dangerous to keep, and fond of turning to ash at dawn. Still, the taller called herself Lyris and the shorter called herself Vale, and they said very little while they drank his tea, yet the silence around them softened his shop the way blankets soften an unkind bed, and it was a strangeness to watch the storm reflected in their eyes, as if those eyes remembered older tempests with heavier teeth, and stranger still how his old heater coil an unpromising loop that had survived 2 landlords and 5 owners glowed with the steady gold of a new forge when they drew near, and how the metallic taste left the air as if it had been encouraged to evaporate by something more persuasive than heat. Orion found himself talking to fill the places where awe wanted to grow. He told them of the freighter outside and its cross-threaded heart, of the rust lichen that crept toward the power bus like a siege, of a rumor that an Imperial inspection ship had been seen over the basin at noon, and when he said that last word Imperial both travelers exchanged the smallest glance, neither fear nor surprise, but the resigned acknowledgement of people who have been found by news they were trying to outrun. He apologized for his curiosity even as he asked if their transport had truly died or had merely chosen an inopportune moment to refuse them, and the shorter Vale grinned in a way that made the old tea-tins tremble, and confessed that their craft had not so much died as flung a bearing in theatrical protest, because some machines have a flair for melodrama when their pilots attempt to fly them like couriers instead of choristers. Orion laughed, sudden and unhandsome, and the laugh made the night more domestic. And when the taller Lyris set her cup down, she said something that rearranged the furniture of his life, that they did not need sleep, but had agreed to try it because the road had been long and new experiences are a form of courtesy, that they would rest a few hours in the quiet geometry of his well-ordered tools if he permitted, and that when morning reassembled the world they would depart, leaving him the favor pledged and a blessing for the shed's gutters to remember. He granted permission he had no authority to grant, led them through narrow aisles that smelled of solvent and old leather to the 2 sleeping pallets he kept against the back wall relics of a time he'd taken on an apprentice and then lost him to a fever that medicine called minor until it wasn't, and when Lyris sat, the cot's tired mesh sighed in relief as if gravity had been mercifully adjusted, and when Vale stretched the heater coil threw off sparks that arced and fell like silver. Dragonflies, and Orion, who had not been visited by wonder in years, found he was unwilling to leave them and equally unwilling to remain. So he drifted between his bench and the door, pretending to inventory fuses while the storm shook its wet mane and the desert sang low in the drainpipes. It might have ended there, a night of improbable guests and a story he would tell badly to himself later, but halfway to midnight the wreckyard dogs began to bark in that particular cadence that means not feral cats nor scavengers but men, and the men came with lamps hooded in blue, and their footsteps struck the puddled ferrocrete with a rhythm Orion's spine remembered, officers marching to collect on a debt that had not been paid, and behind them a second rhythm, heavier and more deliberate. The footfall of a machine that does not stumble because it does not understand the idea of falling. And when the lamp slid under the hatch and licked the edges of his tools, he knew before the knock that the Imperial inspection ship rumor had been more than rumor, and before the door boomed he knew he should have said no to the night's hospitality, and before he turned. Chapter 2. A favor promised, a world invited. The knock this time was a demand built into wood, and the voice that followed announced itself as Auditor Colonel Sorov of the Imperial Compliance Directorate, which was both 2 many syllables and exactly the number required to make a repairman's tools weep. Orion swallowed the instinct to throw the bar and run, because there were nowhere, and now him to run to. And when he glanced at Lyris and Vale he saw that their calm had become stillness of a different grade, the kind of stillness that engineers use when urging reactors to stay inside their housings, and he understood in a sliver of clarity that whatever they were trying to be less of it, so that his shed would not have to learn new physics. He opened the hatch 3 inches, enough to let the colonel's badge glint and the cold smell of factory rain creep in, and said in the small voice that kept him from tickets that yes, he was Orion Hale, and yes, this was his license shed, and no, he was not harboring fugitives or stolen Imperial property, and yes, the inspectors might come in to verify that statement because he had nothing to hide beyond a stack of unpaid notices and a graveyard of half-fixed dreams. The colonel, whose face Orion would later describe as the expression a knife would make if it could be disappointed, stepped inside with 2 aides and an infantry pair in brushed armor that had never been closer to grease than parade polish. And behind them the heavier steps stopped at the threshold because the machine, some kind of bipedal compliance unit with a glass belly full of softly thinking light, was too proud to bend its spine under a poor door. The colonel flicked a hand toward Orion's benches, toward the pallets, toward the guts of the freighter outside, and Orion did a quick and convincing job of being the least interesting object in the room, which is a species of magic practiced by men who survive on small jobs and smaller lunches. The aides fanned through his sanctuary and took notes on slates that hummed like suppressed insects, and the infantry peered into nooks that held no secrets and into crates that held only the kind of secrets that smell like oil. And the colonel did not even bother to pretend to look. He looked instead at Orion and said the Empire's long hand was out tonight because the high meridian, by which he meant, Orion realized with a jolt, the Emperor's navigational error had gone unaccounted for in this quadrant since mid-afternoon, accompanied by a second of similar significance, and that certain signatures of field distortion had suggested their presence near the wreck yard when a storm cell was building, and that he, the colonel, would be very pleased if Orion were the sort of man who understood that small kindnesses to the Empire are indistinguishable from large fortunes to those who offer them. Orion's tongue but not his mind considered the safety of lies, but before words could stagger out, Vale spoke from the shadows with the bright, unhelpful cheer of a match struck in a powder room, announcing that the tea had gone cold and she wished to reheat it, but the coil was only adequate if it had help. And then she stepped into the lamplight with her hood down, and the Empire entered his shed in a new way, a very old way. For the colonel's aides did not gasp, but their slates stopped humming, as their hands forgot to move, and the infantry's armor-fine brushed parade metal stopped being a uniform and became a poor suggestion of armor next to a creature whose gaze widened the room, and the colonel, to his credit, bowed a degree shallow for a dragon princess and addressed her by a formal title Orion had not heard outside songs, and almost asked if the High Meridian and her sister would be returning to their father's palace now, as the night was unkind to those who loved them. Lyris stepped forward with a patience that would have made a mountain reconsider its angles, and Orion felt the heater coils glow step back to give her room, and she said that they would leave when the storm loosened its teeth, and the mechanist whose kindness had offered harbor to 2 travelers without naming their nature had been recompensed in equal measure, because the law of the road bites even princes who fly over it. The colonel's gaze spilled over Orion as if he were a node in the margin and then returned to Lyris, and he measured the calculus of risk and politics and decided to smile without showing his teeth, and he said the Empire would of course honor any kindness shown to its daughters, but that wandering so far with only a small craft and a single escort, a shape he gestured at irritably, as if the compliance machine had failed a test it hadn't been told was happening, was unwise given the feverish mood of border systems. And in the near distance, Thunder laid a velvet hand across the wreck yard, as if to remind everyone that the sky favors no banners. Vale, who could not leave a mood unsparked, told the colonel she appreciated his concern and also his attempt at a polite scold, but that she had wanted to see what rain felt like when it was stolen from clouds that did not consent, and that the wreck yard had more romance than an imperial promenade because everything in it had failed in the open air and still insisted on existing. And Orion felt a sting in his eyes because he felt sometimes like a hinge that kept a door on a house nobody wanted. And to have a dragon, if that is what she was, speak romance into the tin ribs of his shed made his poor spine sit taller. Lyris inclined her head to Orion and asked not with entitlement, but with the weight of ceremony if he would accept the favor of Ember and the promise of return, wording that Orion did not understand but recognized as the sort of phrasing that makes contracts out of breath. He said yes before his fear could draft a counteroffer, because fear is a poor negotiator and wonder is a better friend. and in that moment, as if the air had been waiting for the syllable, the storm's belly tore itself open, and rain came like molten glass suddenly cooled, and the compliance unit outside howled in machine language at the water on its joints, and Vale laughed the kind of laugh that heals minor treacheries in metal. What followed was a kind of inspection that only looked like an imperial one. The colonel made a show of peering into things while keeping his eyes respectfully off the princesses. If princesses is the right word for what dragon royalty become when they decide to look like girls with dust on their boots, and Orion, who had met three varieties of official in his life: those who needed to be bribed to do nothing, those who needed to be flattered to do anything, and those who were terrified of the consequences of doing either, recognized the colonel as a fourth, a professional survivor whose ambition wore the empire the way a ship wears a hull, tight and necessary, and always groaning in the cold. He paused at Orion's ledger and made a mark of no consequence that would return later as a small mercy, and he spoke into his sleeve to the machine outside and used the kind of codes that make machines feel complimented even as they are commanded, and then, with care, he suggested that Dawn would find fewer accidents if the High Meridian agreed to travel in convoy and allow his compliance unit to sweep the road before their craft. Lyris thanked him in the language of furnaces, which sounds like a blessing to human ears and like a welding lesson to machines, and said she would consider his counsel. And then she turned her consideration toward Orion in a way that made him understand what it feels like to be a star subjected to deliberate navigation, and asked if he would, in the thin bone of morning, walk with them the 20 clicks to their ship, because there was something they wished him to do to it that only someone who loved the honest texture of brokenness could do. Orion had no business accepting tasks from empires or their children. He had a freighter to trick into compliance, a debt to keep marginally tamed, and 24 small obligations that growled if not fed, but he heard himself saying that he owned a battered cart that could carry tools, and that he was not fast, but he was steady. And Vale clapped in genuine delight that made the heater coil briefly throw off the light of a body-sized star. And the colonel's mouth did a small, unhappy thing that meant logistics were being recalculated. The night uncoiled from its tight watchfulness after that, easing into a kind of coexistence. The colonel left 2 infantry at the hatch and stationed the compliance unit under the eaves like an obedient vulture, and he himself retreated to the shade of a shuttle's wing to mutter into encrypted channels. And inside the shed the dragon girls did what nearly no one of any rank or age bothers to do in the presence of a poor man's work. They admired it. They moved among Orion's benches with reverence for the choreography of his tools. They remarked on the way his spares were sorted by personality rather than alphabet. They asked the story of a cracked drive ring whose brake had been mended with love and brass wire. And through the telling, Orion found his shame evaporating like a cheap solvent, leaving behind only the grain of pride that had been there all along like the heartwood of a plank. He slept at last in a chair with his feet on a crate, and dreamed not of money but of a freighter that started on the first good word. And when he woke, the storm's breath had thinned to cool mist, and the world outside looked scrubbed and new. And Lyris was pouring tea with the precise hands of someone who lets the water believe it has invented heat. And Vale was arguing cheerfully with the compliance unit about the merits of friction in a universe that worships efficiency, and the colonel's eyes were swollen from a night of worrying and ambition fighting like cats in a bag, and Dawn, which in the basin is more event than hour, reached a yellow finger under the hatch and tapped the day awake. Chapter 3. The Cart, the Road, and the Song of Machines. They set out when the wreckyard dogs had finished counting the sunbeams, and the lambent haze above the basin felt like the inside of a pilot's helmet, warm and smelling faintly of old leather and adrenaline. Orion pushed his cart with the stubborn grace of a man accustomed to making distance out of spite. The compliance unit stalked on his left like a mechanical heron. The colonel's shuttle paced them on silent thrusters at a respectful altitude because Lyris had told it to do so without words. And the dragon girls walked in boots that did not quite touch the ground because the ground had fallen briefly in love with them and was stepping up to meet them. The road to the west, if you can call a collection of permissions a road, wound through the ribcage of a ship grave where hulls lay like bones and sightlines were carved by the teeth of failed ambitions. Orion narrated as they went, not to impress, but to share the small gospel of the basin, and pointed out a set of stabilizers that sang at noon as if mourning an absent wing. A row of cracked coolant spheres whose contents had crystallized into turquoise salt that children steal to make necklaces. For gods, a scarf of fused alloy that a lightning strike had spun into glass thin as a promise. And Vale listened with the avid hunger of someone who understands that wonder is a meal and not a snack, while Lyris asked questions that felt like being measured for a suit by a tailor who wanted the clothes to fit your soul. When they stopped to rest in the shade of a broken atmospheric scoop, Orion demonstrated the correct way to persuade a stubborn gyrostabilizer to free its locked axis. Sing to it in a voice that ignores time signatures. Tap it with a non-magnetic wrench in a rhythm that suggests you are not angry, but profoundly disappointed. Then lubricate with oil you have warmed in your palm, because metal respects intimacy. And Vale tried the technique and laughed when the axis sighed and rotated with the bashful gratitude of a mule allowed to go home. And the compliance unit recorded the sequence and filed it under folk procedures. Efficiency questionable, morale high. And the colonel pretended not to witness the entry, because he was not paid to know that hearts can change gear ratios. Lyris guided their pace with the ease of a pilot who has never used a map that did not argue. And twice she paused, tilted her head, and corrected course by a hand's width to avoid pockets of ground where gravity had pulled at an unfriendly angle. And Orion felt his trust rearrange itself around her the way metal filings rearrange themselves around a magnet. Helplessly, delightedly. Full of private clicking noises that only matter to the part of you that aligns. They reached the ship 2 hours past midday when the sun had leaned into its work and the basin's colors had faded to disciplined whites and browns. It sat on a rise of scrub like an animal too proud to collapse, the hull patterned with the ash Orion had tasted on their boots. And it was at once the most elegant and most exhausted craft he had seen. Not imperial in design, no stamped declaration of authority. No authoritarian symmetry, but something older that had been taught manners rather than laws. A long-bellied courier with fins that suggested speed had once been a joy rather than an obligation. And as he drew close, he heard something that made his throat close. The engine sang very, very softly to itself, the way engines do when they are dreaming of running. Lyris placed her palm on the hatch, and the hull made a small sound of recognition that left Orion embarrassed, like watching a kiss between old lovers who had been parted by an argument and a wall. Vale ducked under his arm with the shameless agility of a younger sibling and pulled the hatch with a twist that no mechanic manual would describe, because no manual imagines hands that were born in furnaces. And inside the cabin the air smelled like ozone and the clean end of fear, and the boards were scuffed with the story of a forced landing written in mathematics and profanity. The fault lay where Lyris had said. A coolant vein had torn itself away when a bearing threw a jealous tantrum, and the tear had sprayed a fine mist that had flash frozen into a lace of blue frost. And somewhere in the lacing the inverter had taken a sulky wound and refused to pretend, and the machine had done what proud things do when hurt in their core. It had landed with dignity and waited to be addressed properly. Orion told them the truth, that he could patch the vein, bully the inverter, and coax the bearing to apologize, but only if the ship would forgive him for not being the right person for the job. And Vale snorted and said the ship knew gratitude when it felt it and would likely fall in love with him a little. And Lyris inclined that mountain-moving head and said that if Orion sang the right notes the ship would sing back, because love trained into machines always recognizes itself when called at the correct frequency. He set to work with the seriousness that men reserve for small tasks that might, if the world is paying attention, convince the enormous to behave. He warmed the blue frost in cupped hands until it wept. He chased the tear along the coolant vein like a tailor following a ripped seam. He threaded in a length of flexible alloy from his cart that had already learned how to forgive flawed geometries. He listened to the inverter's sulky clicks and told it stories of other inverters who had forgiven worse slights and gone on to power ships that became ballads. And the dragon girls watched the way apprentices do and did not interrupt, though Vale slid small tools into his reach before he knew he needed them. And Lyris kept the air at the exact temperature that prevents solder from making up its mind prematurely. Outside, the colonel and the compliance unit looked toward the horizon where a line of dust implied other travelers with less polite intentions, and Orion heard himself say, halfway into a repair that felt like prayer, that if this were his ship, he would bond the coolant vein not with standard resin, but with a compound he made for mining rigs that had to survive temper tantrums of the earth. And Lyris said it was his ship for the hour and his law for the day, and he mixed the compound with hands that had done this 200 times while thinking of nothing. And for the first time he did it while thinking of the weight of eyes that could smelt mountains. And the result was cleaner, faster, truer, and the ship sighed like someone who has been allowed to be the best version of themselves after a stretch of being ordinary for other people's safety. When the engine took a breath and decided to be alive, the basin changed. Heat stopped being an enemy and became a partner in a dance that metal understands. The smell of ozone became a promise rather than a threat. The birds that live on the edges of human mess flew nearer to see if there would be crumbs of hot air to snack on. And the colonel's shoulders dropped 2 degrees because the calculus of disaster had simplified. Vale whooped with a joy that was not princess appropriate by any empire's handbook and threw her arms around Orion in a hug that smelled faintly of smoke and mint. And Lyris placed her hand on the engine housing and spoke a word that Orion felt in his teeth, and the ship lifted an inch nod in disobedience, but as a way of nodding and settled again with a sound like rain on a childhood window. They could have left then, could have thanked the poor mechanic and carried him back to his shed, and placed in his palm a favor that would buy Death's mouth shut for a century, and perhaps that would have been the kind version of destiny. But the basin's horizon had decided to be an actor and not a set, and the dust line resolved itself into 6 riders on low-slung bikes that hummed at a pitch that makes honest metal nervous, and behind them a truck whose bed bristled with antennae that want to listen to things they are not supposed to hear, and above them a drone whose fat belly suggested it had eaten too much ordnance for breakfast. And the colonel said a word into his sleeve that Orion did not know but recognized as the grown-up version of duck. The riders were local, not imperial, and their colors were the sort worn by people who think owning a road is the same as owning the sky above it. And the lead rider had an emblem on his jacket that said he had once paid for a tattoo he thought would make pain his friend. They fanned in a semicircle that sought to turn the ship into something contained, and the drone slouched lower like a bully discovering a smaller child's lunch. And the truck's antennas turned all at once toward the engine, like sunflowers discovering an argument. The colonel, to his credit and against his self-preservation, moved between the riders and the mechanic's cart, and did the thing bureaucrats are never trained to do and often die attempting. He spoke like a human being to other human beings, and tried to talk trouble into taking a later train, but the riders wanted tribute, and the tribute they wanted had hot lungs. And even if they had recognized Lyris and Vale for what they were, they might still have wanted to see if dragon girls bleed the way legend says they do. Orion is not a fighter and not a hero, but he is a man whose hands refuse the idea that what is broken must remain broken if it prefers to. And he looked at the drone, at the lazy way it bobbed while its targeting routines stretched like cats in sunlight. And he remembered the old mining rigs whose guidance systems he used to tune by teaching them boredom, and he thought, boredom is the enemy of violence because boredom needs entertainment and will chase any shiny, and the basin had a lot of shiny if you knew how to ask it to glitter. He asked. He grabbed 3 mirrors from his cart, the kind you use to look around corners inside engines that hate your wrists, and he angled them in a small inverted pyramid on the scrub, and he nodded to Vale, who had the good sense to understand nods. And she lifted her hand in a motion that warmed the air in a precise cube above the mirrors until the heat became a shimmer that looked like motion to a hungry eye. And the drone's hungry eye coddled by algorithms that had never been taught about. Dragons with mirrors swung its belly and made the mistake of firing a warning shot into a mirage that obligingly swallowed it and burped a shower of dazzled air. In the same breath, Lyris spoke again to the engine in the language of furnaces and asked it to cough a specific cough. And the ship did, spitting a ribbon of ionized air that tasted like a promise of noon, and the riders' bikes, whose threshold circuits had been tuned by men who believed in only one kind of threshold, hiccuped and had to reboot their stabilities. And by the time their wheels remembered gravity, Vale had walked through them and plucked the weapons from their hands with the unkind grace of a chef pulling bones from a fish. And the colonel, who had not moved because the compliance unit had moved for him, found himself with a situation that could be reported as resolved by de-escalation, if one had a sense of humor and a dictionary with non-standard entries. No one died, which is rarer than ballads admit, and the riders left with their pride cleverly repainted as tactical retreat, and the drone went home to its owner to lie about why its logs were full of songs about boredom, and the truck turned its antennas toward the gracious idea of elsewhere. The basin exhaled. The ship, repaired, stretched a wing. Orion's cart, indestructible by poverty and luck, had lost one mirror and gained a story. And it was then, in the quiet after the almost, that Lyris turned to Orion and said that the favor of Ember would be paid now in part and in full later, and that if he wished to come to the Meridian as a guest for 3 days and 1 night his hands would be asked to teach a lesson to engines that had never been made to be humble. Orion, who owned a shed and a collection of half-fixed ships and a ledger full of the names of men who never waved when they walked by, said yes, because sometimes the universe offers a hinge a chance to be a door. Chapter 4. The Meridian and the Engine That Bowed. The Imperial City did not announce itself with banners because empires that believe themselves permanent do not need fabric to remind stone who is king. It rose from the plain like a machine that had decided to be merciful to grass, its towers the color of moons at different moods, its wide conduits sung through with traffic whose noise had been taught to be polite, and Orion, who had never been farther than the basin's rim, sat in the shuttle with his hands folded, as if holding something he did not want to drop, and watched the world behave as if money were a law of physics. Lyris and Vale shed their cloaks as one sheds a story that has reached its ending and walked through the docking ring in boots that now agreed to touch the ground, because the ground here had been taught by dragons how to carry more than stone. Officials bowed in ways that pretended to be instinct. The colonel's face arranged itself into a smile that would make a reasonable career out of this day. The compliance unit took one reverent step and let its glass belly dim because its light felt insufficient, and Orion felt like a man who has brought a good loaf of bread to a banquet and suspects it will be placed in the center and sung about. The Meridian's palace, if palace is what a dragon calls a place to put its hoard of obligations unfolded in rings like the cross-section of a tree that had grown on purpose, and at its heart was not a throne or a war room, but an engine hall, and when Orion saw it he understood a little of why empires rise. Because someone at the beginning builds a room that turns power into a hymn and invites men to stand inside and be forgiven for wanting to sing along. The engine was impossibly old and impossibly maintained, a braided heart of alloys he did not know how to hate, its housings engraved with equations that had been written both as instruction and as poetry, and when Lyris led him to the service walkway and bade him listen, he heard beneath the disciplined hum the sound of compliance. Not the miserable kind that comes from fear, but the sullen kind that drags its feet because it knows it could be brilliant and has been scolded into being excellent. Instead, she is tired of being perfect, Vale said, leaning on the rail with a scandalous lack of fear of heights, and Orion, who has coaxed machines out of moods most men call death, nodded because he knows the sound a soul makes when it wants to love its work and has been told to hold still for the sake of consistency. The Emperor arrived without announcement, as if the room were his skin and he had decided to itch here. He was not older than the Empire or younger than the idea of it. He was a human man in the sense that you could shake his hand and feel both bones and fatigue, and he was a dragon in the sense that the air complained about the burden of containing him. And he wore no crown, because crowns are for those who need help remembering where their heads end. Orion bowed out of instinct and also out of gratitude for the loan of 2 people who had made his shed holy for a night. And the Emperor's mouth did an unfamiliar thing that might have been a real smile when he looked at Lyris and Vale and saw that they had collected something worth returning with. A story, a cart scent of oil, a mechanic whose hands kept faith. "Father," Lyris said, and the word filled the room the way heat fills a kiln, and in that moment the poor man's suspicion hardened into truth. These were not simply imperial wards or ornamented avatars of the court. They were daughters of the sovereign whose jurisdiction included stars that had never learned to pronounce his name, and he, Orion Hale, of the Lahar Basin, had given them blankets and tea and the small sacrament of being left alone to sleep. The weight of it did not crush him, because the favor of Ember had put a scaffold inside his chest. Formalities ensued, but did not burden. The colonel delivered a report that praised everyone in ways that made no enemies. The compliance unit submitted logs redacted to look like self-effacement, and Orion was presented as Mechanist Hale of the Basin, in a tone that suggested one day there might be a hymn. And Lyris wasted no more time on ceremony than is necessary to keep light polite, and got him in front of the engine with a set of tools that did not sparkle because they did not need to. And she told him, in the voice one uses to ask a friend to hold your heart while you undo a knot, that she wanted the engine to move again from perfection into joy. What does a poor mechanic teach an imperial engine? He teaches it that friction is not failure, but music if you choose the right key. He tells it about fans in desert sheds that learned to love resistance because resistance made them sing. He loosens two couplings where the factory had prescribed one, and he retunes a governor with a quarter turn that would get a lesser man shot, and he adds not a part, not a hack but a permission, a small unanxiety in the control loop that says you may vary your pitch as long as the song remains true, and the engine, who had been told for a long time that true and identical are married, tries the idea on like a coat stolen from a theater wardrobe and discovers that it fits around the shoulders that had been cramped by duty. He worked, and as he worked he talked, not because the engine needed words, but because the daughters listened, and he told them about the freighter in his yard that he loved, because it had never pretended not to be old, and about his apprentice who had died, and the way grief had taught him to warm solder in his palm the way he had warmed that boy's cooling fingers, and about the time a miner had paid him with papers to a plot of land that contained only sky, and how he had sat on the plot and watched stars while counting his debts and had decided that owning sky was still wealth. And Vale cried openly because she did not know how to do anything behind a closed curtain, and Lyris cried with the silence of a mountain at dusk when the sun chooses another valley to love. And the emperor did not cry, but his jaw did a thing that is the father of tears and the son of restraint. When Orion finished, he asked the engine to speak. Not louder, not stronger, just to let him hear the part of her voice that she used for herself when alone, and slowly the tone bent, not in defiance but in permission, into a chord that made the hair on Orion's arms stand up, and the colonel's perfectly balanced data slate tremble, and the compliance unit kneel. And the entire palace did the thing things do when the center of a system changes its breath. They recalibrated to a new tenderness. Payment came not as money because money is what you give to men when you want them to go away. Payment came as remembering, and as belonging, and as a letter given to Orion on thick paper that smelled faintly of cedar, stamped with a sigil that made men lean to read, which said that all debts registered against Mechanist Hale with the Basin Water Board and the Bureau of Small Aeronautics and the Office of Patchwork Licenses were now liabilities of the Meridian and would be forgiven not in bulk, but individually, by name, in the order they had been incurred, so that the story of Orion's life would be read by clerks who would have to see his name attached to every small desperate choice he had made, and would have to witness what it is for a man to remain decent under arithmetic designed to break him. Payment came as a parts credit that never expired at a supplier who had never returned his calls. Payment came as the colonel's personal quiet promise to remove the red-lit clamps from his shed and replace them with the kind that light green when inspectors pass, so that he could sleep without feeling watched by light. Payment came as the emperor himself walking with Orion through the engine hall and out under a slice of day where sun burned politely and asking, not ordering, if the mechanic would consider staying at the Meridian in a formal capacity for a season to teach the doctrine of mercy to the palace's machines, because he suspected that an empire that keeps its engines in love might dispense with certain other, uglier disciplines. Orion took a breath that tasted of cedar paper and hot metal and tears, and said that his shed would not forgive him if he abandoned it without teaching it how to be alone, and the emperor laughed a real laugh, and said a shuttle could make the basin in an afternoon, and that duty is not a tether but a road if you build it right. And Lyris said this was the promise of return ripening into the promise kept. And Vale declared she would come to the basin whenever Orion fixed something fun, and that she had a gift for the Reckyard dogs, who had written a song about the storm and deserved a chorus. They took him home at sunset, because dragons understand showmanship even when they are not trying. The shuttle glided low over the Reckyard, and the dogs sang with half-terrified triumph, and Orion's shed, which had never had its gutters blessed properly, gleamed in a way that made neighbors suspicious. And the colonel supervised the removal of clamps with the satisfied melancholy of a man doing one beautiful thing among a career of merely necessary ones, and the compliance unit asked if it could sit under his eaves sometimes when it felt too watched, and he said yes because hospitality is the last law, and Lyris and Vale drank his tea again and pronounced it improved, which made the kettle preen, and they stood awkwardly for a few seconds as people do when the night threatens to turn into memory before it is ready. And then Vale blurted that they had not told him the story's opening line because stories are better when the first words arrive late, and she said, in a rush that flew like sparks into sawdust and did not burn, that their father ruled an empire and that they were his dragon daughters. And Orion smiled a smile he had been saving for a day when he didn't feel poor and said he had guessed, and that he had not taken them in because of father or empire or dragon or favor, but because rain makes the basin cruel and tea makes it kinder, and that if they ever returned without announcement the pallets would be less creaky, because he suddenly had parts credit and intended to spend some on comfort. They left with less ceremony than they had arrived, because ceremony is heavy and love likes to travel with a small bag. The shuttle lifted, the basin returned to its ordinary mathematics, and Orion stood in his doorway and let the knight walk toward him without asking what price it intended to exact, because some knights pay up front, and this had been one. He slept like a man whose ledger had been set on fire by a patient god. In the weeks that followed, letters came, some on cedar paper, and some on cheap stock with stamps that had been licked by a clerk who was bored, and then suddenly not. Parts arrived that Orion had only ever seen in catalogs behind paywalls. Clients arrived who had never admitted to needing help, and now queued with the meek fury of men realizing their pride had held them back from joy. The freighter he had promised to coax thrummed like a throat that has finally learned the tune, and the Reckyard dogs grew fat on scraps from the palace because Vale had declared that their song required better diet. The colonel visited once and stood in the door with his hat off and asked if the heater coil still behaved, and Orion told him it did, and that he would not trade it for a new one because the coil had watched a dragon sleep, and that does something to the way a thing warms a room. The compliance unit visited twice and learned, awkwardly and then gracefully, how to nap. Sometimes at night, alone at his bench with the rain practicing scales on the roof, Orion would think of the engine that had bent its tone, and of the emperor walking without crown, and of Lyris's quiet that broke only to make space for other people's truths, and of Vale's laugh that taught machines to forgive themselves, and he would realize that while his debts had been forgiven individually, the larger debt the one a man owes to the world when the world decides to be kind to him in a way that feels personal remained, and that he intended to pay it in the only coin he had. Good work done honestly, tea offered without tally, blankets shaken out, and aired for unexpected guests. Ending, Ember's promise kept. Years from that night, when the basin's weather had learned to bow to gutters that did not clog, and when Orion's shed had become a place apprentices dreamed of instead of feared, the ballads would insist the poor mechanic took in 2 dragon girls and was surprised to learn who their father was. The ballads would be wrong about the surprise, but right about the girls, and wrong about the father, but right about the empire, and wrong about the man, but right about his hands. What is true is that 2 daughters of heat and horizon tried sleeping for a night in a place where the wind smells like iron and old electricity, and a poor man gave them tea and space and did not press their names into gold. And in exchange they gave him a promise that was not a coin but a doorway, and that doorway opened and kept opening until a shed at the edge of the rec yard became a hinge on which a kinder version of power swung. And if, some seasons, a courier ship of a very old and elegant make landed at dusk beside Orion's freighter, and 2 travelers leapt out with boots that kissed the ground, and asked if the coil still remembered them, and if there was anything interesting to repair, the basin only smiled and threw its dust into the air to make the sunset bolder. Because the world loves a story that begins with a knock and ends with the promise that the next knock will come again, and again, as long as there is tea. As long as there is rain to be kept at the door, as long as there are engines too proud to ask for help and men too decent to let that pride make them cold.